Chapter 1. A Chill in the Air. Eleanor Albright sat stiffly in the back seat of the car as it climbed the narrow, winding road into the Scottish Highlands. The snow had started to fall early that morning, blanketing the landscape in a pristine white shroud, and now it came down in heavier sheets, the wipers on the windshield barely able to keep up. To Eleanor, it was less picturesque than suffocating, as though the world were closing in on her. "Miss, we're almost there," the driver called over his shoulder, his voice a mixture of politeness and weariness. It was evident he was less than thrilled about navigating these treacherous roads for the sake of a spoiled heiress. Eleanor didn't bother to reply. She knew exactly what he thought of her. Everyone did. The tabloids made certain of that. Eleanor Albright, the Ice Queen. Eleanor Albright, the disgraced heiress. She turned her gaze back to the snow-draped scenery outside the window, trying to ignore the knot of tension in her stomach. Her father, the late Julian Albright, had adored Christmastime and had always insisted on spending it at Windermere Manor. For years, he had hosted lavish parties in the sprawling Victorian house, inviting everyone from distant family members to prominent figures in business and society. But this year, the manor would host no grand celebrations. Just Eleanor. Alone. She had been reluctant to come at all. The place held too many memories, most of them bittersweet, and the idea of spending Christmas there without her father seemed unbearable. But duty called. The estate's lawyers had been insistent that she sign off on the inventory of the house before the new year, and the idea of staying in London, surrounded by empty holiday cheer and insincere invitations, was even less appealing. As the car rounded the final curve, Windermere Manor came into view. The sight of it never failed to take her breath away. The house rose from the snowy landscape like something out of a Gothic novel, its pointed gables and arched windows silhouetted against the gray sky. Ivy climbed the stone walls, now dusted with snow, and smoke curled lazily from one of the chimneys, promising warmth inside. Despite her misgivings, a flicker of nostalgia stirred in her chest. The car came to a halt at the foot of the long, gravel driveway. A stout, elderly housekeeper bustled out to meet her, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf. Mrs. Mackenzie had been a fixture at Windermere for as long as Eleanor could remember, and her lined face softened into a smile at the sight of her. "Welcome back, Miss Albright," she said warmly, though her eyes held a hint of sadness. "The house is ready for you, and I've made sure there's a fire going in the drawing room. I'll get your bags." "Thank you, Mrs. Mackenzie," Eleanor said, her voice clipped but not unkind. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tightly around her. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed Mrs. Mackenzie up the stone steps. Inside, the house was as she remembered it, grand yet eerily still. The sweeping staircase dominated the entryway, its banister adorned with evergreen garlands that filled the air with the scent of pine. The drawing room to the left glowed with the light of a roaring fire, and the faint aroma of mulled wine and cinnamon lingered in the air. Yet the house felt hollow, as though it were holding its breath. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was trespassing on something sacred. She wandered through the familiar rooms, her footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors. The portraits of her ancestors lined the walls, their painted faces watching her with expressions of quiet judgment. She stopped before a particularly imposing portrait of her great-grandfather, whose stern eyes seemed to follow her wherever she moved. "Still disapproving after all these years," she muttered, brushing a speck of dust from the frame. "He's not the only one." The voice startled her, and she spun around to find a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead and a hint of stubble on his jaw. His clothes were unremarkable, a threadbare sweater and jeans, but there was an undeniable charisma about him, an air of quiet confidence that set him apart. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her tone sharp. "Finn Gallagher," he said with a crooked smile. "Mrs. Mackenzie didn't tell you? I'm the artist she hired to restore some of the murals. I've been here for a week." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "I wasn't informed of this. Would you like me to leave?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't think she would. Eleanor hesitated. The house was vast and lonely, and the thought of another person's presence, even an unwelcome one, was oddly comforting. She drew herself up, fixing him with a haughty look. "As long as you stay out of my way, Mr. Gallagher, you may continue your work," she said coolly. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and strode toward the drawing room. Behind her, Finn chuckled softly. "Yes, ma'am." The evening passed in uneasy silence. Eleanor sat by the fire, a book open in her lap, though she barely read a word. Her thoughts were scattered, flitting between memories of Christmases past and the unexpected arrival of Finn Gallagher. There was something infuriating about him, the way he had looked at her, as though he could see right through her icy facade. Later, as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she paused at the landing, her eyes drawn to a sprig of mistletoe hanging from the ceiling. It had been there for as long as she could remember, a relic of her father's love for tradition. She reached up to touch it, her fingers brushing the dried leaves, and a shiver ran down her spine. It was as though the house were whispering to her, urging her to remember something long forgotten. She shook her head and continued up the stairs. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, blanketing the world in silence. Wintermere Manor stood resolute against the elements, its secrets buried deep within its walls. And somewhere in the shadows, a story was beginning to unfold. Chapter 2: Brushstrokes and Barriers. Morning came reluctantly to Wintermere Manor, the pale sunlight filtering through heavy gray clouds that threatened more snow. Eleanor stirred from a restless sleep, her dreams filled with fleeting, fragmented images of the past. She sat up, rubbing her temples, and glanced toward the frost-rimmed window. The world beyond was a vast, silent expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouette of the forest that bordered the manor grounds. Dressing quickly in a simple wool sweater and trousers, she descended the grand staircase to the smell of coffee and the faint hum of activity. Mrs. Mackenzie was bustling in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans echoing faintly through the halls. Eleanor made her way to the dining room, where a modest breakfast had been laid out on the long oak table. To her surprise, Finn Gallagher was already there, seated at the far end with a steaming mug of coffee and a sketchbook open before him. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral but his eyes betraying a flicker of amusement. "Good morning, Miss Albright," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I hope you don't mind my making myself at home." Eleanor's gaze swept over the table, noting the half-eaten toast and the pencil smudges on Finn's hands. "So long as you keep to your work and don't disturb the rest of the house, Mr. Gallagher, you may eat all the toast you like." "Generous of you," he replied, unfazed by her frosty tone. She ignored him and sat at the opposite end of the table, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the scratching of Finn's pencil as he returned to his sketch. Eleanor sipped her coffee and glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His concentration was almost disarming. The way his hand moved with effortless precision, capturing something unseen on the page. She quickly averted her gaze, unwilling to let her curiosity show. "You don't strike me as the type to stay in a place like this," Finn said suddenly, not looking up from his sketch. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. "And what type would that be, Mr. Gallagher?" "The type who enjoys solitude in snowstorms," he replied, his tone light but edged with something more. "Though I suppose that depends on what you're running from." Her eyes narrowed. "You know nothing about me." Finn set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unsettling intensity. No, but I've known enough people like you to recognize the signs. The walls you put up, the way you'd rather freeze than let anyone close enough to see the cracks. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. You presume a great deal, Mr. Gallagher. He shrugged, unbothered by her sharp tone. Occupational hazard. Artists tend to notice things others don't. Eleanor rose abruptly, the scrape of her chair loud in the quiet room. If you'll excuse me, I have things to attend to. Finn inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Of course. Don't let me keep you. The day unfolded in fits and starts, the storm outside showing no signs of abating. Eleanor busied herself with sorting through the inventory left by the estate lawyers, combing through endless lists of furniture, artwork, and heirlooms. The work was tedious but kept her mind occupied, allowing her to avoid both Finn and the memories that seemed to cling to every corner of the manor. By mid-afternoon, she found herself in the conservatory, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the snow-covered grounds. The room had been her mother's favorite, filled with lush greenery and the scent of blooming flowers even in winter. Now, it felt cold and abandoned, the plants long dead and the air heavy with neglect. Eleanor picked up a tarnished watering can, running her fingers over the ornate handle. She could almost hear her mother's laughter, the sound of her voice as she explained the care each plant required. The memory was like a knife to the heart, sharp and sudden. She set the can down with a trembling hand and turned away, her chest tight. She was startled to find Finn standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Are you following me now?" she demanded, her voice harsher than she intended. "Hardly," he said, stepping into the room. "Mrs. Mackenzie mentioned the conservatory. I wanted to see it for myself." "Well, you've seen it. Now, if you don't mind." "It must have been beautiful once," he said, cutting her off. His gaze swept over the glass ceiling and the faded tiles beneath their feet. "Even now, there's something about it. A kind of quiet sadness." Eleanor turned away, unwilling to let him see how his words affected her. "It's just a room. Nothing more." "If you say so," Finn replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe her. He moved to one of the long-dead plants, brushing a finger over the brittle leaves. "You know, not everything that looks dead is beyond saving. Sometimes, all it needs is the right care." She froze, her back to him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind outside was a low, mournful howl, and the glass walls shivered with the force of it. "Why are you here?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "In this house, I mean. Why take this job?" Finn hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his expression. "Maybe I'm running from something too," he said. Their eyes met, and for a brief, unguarded moment, Eleanor felt the weight of her own walls pressing down on her. She looked away quickly, retreating to the safety of her icy demeanor. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for," she said curtly. Without waiting for a response, she swept past him and out of the conservatory, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. That night, Eleanor lay awake in the vast, cold expanse of her bed. The house creaked and groaned around her, the storm outside battering the windows. She couldn't shake the feeling that Finn's arrival was more than coincidence, that his presence in the manor was somehow tied to its secrets. But trusting him, letting him in, felt impossible. It was easier to keep him at arm's length, to pretend his words didn't stir something buried deep within her. Easier and far safer. As sleep finally claimed her, a single thought lingered in her mind. Not everything that looks dead is beyond saving. Chapter 3. The Blizzard's Embrace. The following morning broke in a hazy shroud, the manor wrapped in a cocoon of fog so dense it seemed the world beyond Wintermere had ceased to exist. Eleanor awoke with a start, her dreams fading like smoke. The cold, heavy air in her room felt oppressive, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if the stories of Wintermere's curse were more than folklore. She shook the thought away and dressed with mechanical efficiency, determined to carry on with her plans. The manor required her attention, practical, immediate decisions about its future, and she refused to let either the snowstorm or the presence of Finn Gallagher distract her. But Finn was difficult to ignore. Eleanor found him in the library, a cavernous room lined with shelves of books whose spines bore the wear of generations. The scent of aged paper mingled with the faint tang of the ever-present cold. Finn stood at the far end, studying a large oil painting that dominated the wall above the hearth. The painting depicted a young woman in a flowing green gown, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders as she gazed out from the frame with an enigmatic smile. A stag stood beside her, its antlers entwined with ivy, and the background was a wild, untamed forest. "The Lady of Wintermere," Eleanor said, announcing her presence. Finn turned, his expression contemplative. "She has a certain power, doesn't she? As if she's watching you as much as you're watching her." "That's the idea," Eleanor replied, stepping closer. "The painting's been here for over 2 centuries. Legend has it she was the first mistress of Wintermere, and the one who cursed the manor." Finn raised an eyebrow. "Cursed? That's quite the legacy." Eleanor's lips quirked in a humorless smile. She fell in love with a man her family deemed unsuitable. When he was killed in a hunting accident, some say arranged by her father, she swore that no one who loved under this roof would find happiness. Finn tilted his head, his gaze returning to the painting. Tragic, but convenient for explaining away bad luck, don't you think? Perhaps, Eleanor conceded. But Wintermere does have a way of living up to its reputation. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the space between them charged with an unspoken challenge. Eleanor broke the connection first, turning her attention to the shelves. "If you're done pondering ghosts, I have a task for you," she said briskly. "Some of the paintings need to be cataloged for appraisal. Since you're here on business, you might as well earn your keep." Finn's grin was infuriatingly easy. "I'll take that as a compliment to my artistic eye." Eleanor left him in the library and retreated to her study, but her focus wavered. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, the relentless wind rattling the windows like an impatient visitor. She tried to bury herself in the ledgers and documents spread across her desk, but her mind drifted, replaying Finn's words and the way he'd looked at her, as though he saw far more than she was willing to reveal. By midday, a sense of restlessness drove her to explore the manor. She wandered through its labyrinthine halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air seemed heavier here, charged with memories she could almost touch. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring down with imperious expressions. Tapestries hung faded and threadbare, their scenes of mythical beasts and ancient battles blurred by time. She paused in front of a narrow door tucked into a shadowed alcove. It was one she'd never opened before, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then, curiosity overcame her. The door creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A chill ran through her, but she descended cautiously, her hand trailing along the damp stone wall. The stairs led to a small, vaulted room filled with an assortment of forgotten relics, trunks, crates, and stacks of books covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a large wooden chest, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Eleanor knelt beside it, her heart beating faster as she lifted the lid. Inside were papers, letters written in an elegant hand, and a velvet pouch. She opened the pouch to reveal a delicate gold locket, its surface engraved with an intricate design of ivy and stars. The clasp was stiff with age, but she managed to open it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a man with striking features and piercing eyes. Find something interesting? Eleanor nearly dropped the locket. She turned to see Finn standing at the base of the stairs, his expression equal parts curiosity and amusement. "What are you doing down here?" she demanded, clutching the locket as if it were a secret she could protect by sheer force of will. "I heard footsteps and followed. Didn't realize I'd stumble into a treasure hunt." She rose to her feet, the locket dangling from her fingers. "It's nothing. Just some old family keepsakes." Finn stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the locket. "May I?" Eleanor hesitated, then handed it to him. He examined it with an artist's eye, his fingers tracing the engraving. Beautiful craftsmanship, and this portrait. He must have meant a great deal to someone. "He did," Eleanor said quietly. "If the stories are true, he was the Lady of Windermere's lover." Finn looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. "And now he's just a ghost in a locket." Eleanor took the locket back, her expression guarded. Some things are better left in the past. Finn's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded. "Maybe. But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us." That evening, as Eleanor sat by the fire in the drawing room, the locket rested on the table beside her. She turned it over in her hands, its weight both comforting and unnerving. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the corner of the room. But when she looked again, there was nothing. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Windermere Manor held more secrets than she had bargained for, and that Finn Gallagher was somehow entwined in all of them. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Walls. The storm's fury raged on into the next day, its howling winds battering the walls of Windermere Manor as if seeking entry. The snowdrifts now reached halfway up the ground floor windows, casting a muted gray light into the grand rooms. Eleanor stood in the main hall, gazing up at the colossal chandelier that hung like an icicle from the ceiling, its crystals sparkling faintly in the dim glow of the overcast sky. She had awoken early, restless from dreams she could barely remember but which left her feeling unsettled. The locket she had found the day before now rested in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the secrets it contained. Finn's words lingered in her mind. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us. Eleanor shook off the thought and turned her attention to the day's tasks. The estate's caretaker had managed to prepare a simple breakfast in the kitchen despite the dwindling supplies, and she planned to use the morning to review the inventory of Windermere's holdings. She had avoided Finn since their encounter in the hidden room, but she knew that avoiding him indefinitely was impossible. Eleanor's solitude didn't last long. She had barely begun to sort through a box of old letters in the study when Finn appeared in the doorway. He leaned casually against the frame, his arms crossed and a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Good morning, Lady of Windermere," he said, his tone teasing. "Busy solving the mysteries of the manor?" Eleanor's gaze flicked to him briefly before returning to the papers in her hands. "Good morning, Mr. Gallagher. I'm simply trying to bring some order to this chaos. You look like someone who's found more questions than answers," Finn observed, stepping into the room. "Mind if I help?" She hesitated, then gestured to a stack of books on a nearby table. "If you're so inclined, you can start with those. They need to be cataloged." Finn picked up a leather-bound volume and flipped through its pages, his movements unhurried. "You know, I've been wondering about something," he said after a moment. "This place. It feels like it's holding its breath, as if it's waiting for something to happen." Eleanor glanced at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Maybe it's just the storm, or the way the shadows move in these old halls. But there's an energy here. Like the walls have stories to tell." Her expression softened, though she tried to hide it. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say Wintermere had a soul of its own." Finn's eyes brightened with curiosity. "Did she? What else did she say about it?" Eleanor hesitated, torn between dismissing his question and indulging the flicker of warmth his interest sparked. Finally, she relented. She believed the manor was alive in its own way, that it remembered the lives and loves of everyone who'd ever lived here. "She used to tell me stories about the Lady of Wintermere and her doomed romance." "That must have been quite the bedtime tale," Finn said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "It was," Eleanor admitted. "But as I got older, I realized they were just stories. Romantic nonsense." "And yet you still carry her locket," Finn observed. Eleanor froze, her hand instinctively going to her pocket. "How did you know I had it?" "You've been touching your pocket all morning," he said with a small smile. "I'm an artist, Eleanor. I notice things," she sighed, pulling the locket out and holding it up between them. The gold caught the light, its delicate engraving shimmering faintly. "It's just a piece of jewelry, nothing more." Finn stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the locket. "Do you really believe that?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a loud thud echoed from somewhere deep within the manor. Both of them turned toward the sound, the tension in the room thickening. "What was that?" Finn asked, his voice low. "Probably the wind," Eleanor said, though the unease in her voice betrayed her. "It didn't sound like the wind," Finn replied. He set the book down and moved toward the door. "Let's find out." "Wait," Eleanor said, following him. "You can't just go wandering around. This place is a maze." "Then it's a good thing I have you to guide me," he said with a grin, though the glint in his eyes was serious. The sound had come from the east wing, a part of the manor that hadn't been used in decades. The air grew colder as they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs that hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls here were lined with portraits, their subjects obscured by a layer of grime. They stopped in front of a heavy oak door, slightly ajar. Eleanor hesitated, her pulse quickening. Finn glanced at her, his expression steady. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and together they pushed the door open. The room beyond was a small sitting area, its furniture draped in sheets. Dust motes danced in the pale light streaming through a cracked window. At first, there was no sign of anything amiss. But then Eleanor's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room. A large mirror stood propped against the wall, its surface fogged and streaked. But it wasn't the mirror itself that caught her attention. It was the faint outline of a handprint, smeared across the glass as if someone had pressed their palm against it and dragged it downward. Eleanor's breath caught. "Who?" Finn moved closer to the mirror, his brow furrowed. "That's not dust," he said, his voice quiet. "It's fresh." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the handprint. The room seemed to close in around her, the air heavy with an unspoken threat. She had dismissed the curse as nothing more than a story. But now, with the mirror's eerie mark before her and Finn standing beside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that Wintermere was trying to tell her something. And whatever it was, she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Chapter 5. Colliding Worlds. The air in the east wing felt colder, heavier, as if the old walls themselves exhaled a breath of frost. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the mirror. The ghostly handprint on its surface seemed to pulse with a strange energy, faintly glimmering in the dim light streaming through the cracked window. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. Her voice, barely audible, still echoed in the empty room. "Sense?" Finn's voice was calm, but edged with curiosity. "I think Sense left Wintermere a long time ago." Eleanor's head snapped toward him. "This isn't funny. Someone's been in here." Finn crouched by the mirror, examining the floor beneath it. His long fingers brushed against the dust-covered wood. "No footprints," he said thoughtfully. "Whoever left this didn't come in the usual way." "What does that mean?" Eleanor demanded, her tone sharper than she intended. The unease knotting in her chest made her defensive. "It means," Finn said, standing and dusting his hands off, "that this place might be more alive than we thought." Eleanor turned away, pressing her fingers to her temples. This was absurd. Ghost stories were for children, and curses were nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. She had come to Wintermere to sell it, not to be drawn into its eerie myths. "We should leave this room," she said finally, her voice tight. "There's no reason to stay here." Finn didn't argue, though his expression suggested he wasn't ready to dismiss what they'd found. He followed her out into the corridor, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The sound reverberated through the hall, a deep, hollow thud that lingered unnaturally long. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. Eleanor threw herself into the task of cataloging the manor's belongings, trying to ignore the strange sensations that prickled at the edge of her awareness. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the storm outside, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of Wintermere. Finn, to her mild irritation, appeared unbothered by the events of the morning. He worked methodically in the library, organizing stacks of books and occasionally sketching in his notebook. Eleanor caught glimpses of him when she passed by, his brow furrowed in concentration. She couldn't decide whether his calm demeanor was reassuring or maddening. As evening fell, the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. The wind howled against the windows, and the snow piled higher and higher, cutting them off from the outside world. In the grand dining hall, a fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the dark wood paneling. Eleanor and Finn shared a quiet meal, the tension between them a near tangible presence. "Do you believe in the curse?" Finn asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Eleanor's fork paused midway to her mouth. "No," she said firmly, though the conviction in her voice sounded forced even to her own ears. "It's a story, nothing more." "Stories come from somewhere," Finn said, leaning back in his chair. The firelight played across his features, softening the sharp lines of his face. "There's always a kernel of truth, even in the wildest tales." "And what truth do you think lies behind this one?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her tone light. Finn's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the flicker of playfulness she'd come to expect from him was absent. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think Wintermere is trying to tell us something. We just have to be willing to listen." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She didn't want to listen. She didn't want to know what secrets this house held. All she wanted was to sell it and leave its haunting halls behind. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in the massive four-poster bed in her grandmother's old room, staring up at the ornately carved canopy. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Outside, the wind wailed like a grieving spirit. She closed her eyes, willing herself to relax. But just as she was beginning to drift off, a faint sound reached her ears. A whisper, indistinct but insistent. It seemed to come from the hallway outside her room. Eleanor's eyes flew open, her heart racing. She sat up, straining to hear. The whisper came again, soft and low, like the murmur of a distant conversation. Gathering her courage, she slid out of bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She opened the door and stepped into the dark corridor. The whispers grew louder, though they remained incomprehensible. They seemed to beckon her, leading her toward the east wing. She hesitated, glancing back toward her room, but something compelled her to follow. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold wooden floor as she moved through the shadowy halls. The air grew colder as she approached the east wing, and the whispers seemed to weave around her, filling her mind with a strange, otherworldly hum. When she reached the door to the room where she and Finn had found the mirror, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what lay beyond. But she couldn't walk away, either. Summoning every ounce of courage, she pushed the door open. The room was exactly as they'd left it, the furniture shrouded in dusty sheets and the mirror standing in the corner. But this time, the handprint was gone. Instead, scrawled across the fogged surface of the mirror were 3 words. "Listen to me." Eleanor stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She fled the room, her shawl trailing behind her like a ghost. The whispers returned as she ran, chasing her through the halls, filling her ears with their unintelligible song. When she finally reached her room, she slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her mind racing with questions she didn't want to ask and answers she feared to find. Chapter 6: Shadows Beneath the Snow. The morning came reluctantly, the storm's rage still evident in the gusts of wind that rattled the windows of Wintermere Manor. Pale light seeped through heavy clouds, casting the snow-covered grounds in a muted, ghostly glow. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She hadn't slept, and the events of the previous night clung to her mind like cobwebs. Finn entered the room, his boots leaving damp prints on the stone floor. He had ventured outside early, braving the storm to retrieve firewood from the carriage house. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and snow dusted his dark hair like frost on a midnight canvas. "Morning," he said, setting the bundle of wood near the hearth. His tone was casual, but his sharp eyes immediately noticed her pale complexion and trembling hands. "Rough night?" Eleanor hesitated. She wanted to dismiss his question, to wave off her fears as mere imagination. But the words she'd seen scrawled on the mirror were burned into her mind. "Listen to me." What did it mean? Who, or what, had written it? "I didn't sleep well," she admitted finally, avoiding his gaze. She wrapped her hands around her teacup, seeking its warmth. "This house, it's unnerving." Finn pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, his expression unreadable. "It has that effect on people," he said. "You're not the first to feel it." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" "Wintermere has a history," Finn replied, his voice low. "Stories of strange happenings, of people seeing things they couldn't explain. My grandmother used to talk about it. She said the house remembers." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cup. "Remembers what?" "Pain, loss, regret." Finn's gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of his own memories. "It holds on to those things, like scars." Eleanor wanted to scoff, to dismiss his words as fanciful nonsense. But the image of the mirror, with its cryptic message, refused to leave her mind. "Something happened last night," she said reluctantly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard whispers. They led me to the east wing." Finn's expression darkened. "You went back there?" "I couldn't stop myself," she said. "When I reached the mirror, the handprint was gone. But there were words, written in the fog. It said, 'Listen to me.'" Finn's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the window, where snow continued to fall in a relentless curtain. "The house is speaking to you," he said finally. "It's trying to tell you something." "That's ridiculous," Eleanor snapped, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. "Houses don't speak. Someone is playing games with us." "Maybe," Finn said, his tone nonchalant, but his eyes held a glint of suspicion. "Or maybe it's time we started paying attention." The day passed in uneasy silence. Eleanor busied herself with sorting through the clutter of the manor, cataloging antiques and valuables that might fetch a good price. But her mind kept drifting back to the mirror and the whispers. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes followed her every move. Finn, meanwhile, spent the afternoon in the library. Eleanor occasionally heard the scrape of furniture being moved or the rustle of papers, but he didn't emerge until the sky began to darken. "I found something," he said, appearing in the doorway of the drawing room where Eleanor was inspecting an old jewelry box. His face was alight with excitement, tempered by a hint of apprehension. Eleanor set the box aside and rose to meet him. "What is it?" He held up a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. It belonged to someone named Margaret Caldwell. She lived here in the 1800s. And Finn flipped open the journal to a marked page. She writes about the curse, about how it all started. Eleanor's breath caught. "What does it say?" Finn handed her the journal, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Eleanor's heart skipped, though she wasn't sure if it was the touch or the weight of the book in her hands that caused it. She scanned the page, her eyes quickly absorbing the delicate, looping script. December 23rd, 1847. "The curse is upon us. I feel it in my bones, in the very walls of this house. Love cannot thrive here. It is doomed to wither, to die before it can blossom. Windermere is a place of sorrow, and it will remain so until the sins of the past are atoned for. But how can one atone for a crime of the heart?" Eleanor's fingers trembled as she read. The words felt alive, resonating with the strange energy that seemed to permeate Windermere. "A crime of the heart," she murmured. "What does that mean?" Finn shook his head. "I don't know, but I think this Margaret knew more about the curse than anyone else. If we can find out what happened back then, maybe we can understand what's happening now." Eleanor closed the journal, her mind racing. The weight of Windermere's history pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. "Do you think it can be broken?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Finn's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath his confident facade. "I don't know," he said, "but if there's a way, we'll find it." That night, the storm raged on, and Windermere's halls seemed to pulse with an unearthly life. Eleanor lay awake in bed, the journal resting on the bedside table. The words she'd read echoed in her mind, blending with the howling wind and the creaks of the old house. Somewhere in the depths of Windermere, a faint whisper carried through the darkness. And though she couldn't understand the words, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. The past was not finished with her yet. Chapter 7. Frostbitten Hearts. The following morning dawned brighter, but no less cold. The sky a pale, brittle blue that seemed to reflect the icy mood inside Windermere Manor. Eleanor found herself wandering the manor's endless corridors, the weight of Margaret Caldwell's journal still heavy in her mind. The more she thought about its cryptic warnings, the more determined she became to unravel the truth behind the curse. Finn was already outside by the time she descended the grand staircase, bundled in his threadbare coat and carrying his sketchbook. She watched him through the frost-kissed window as he trudged across the snow, heading toward the tree line that bordered the estate. His movements were purposeful, yet something about his hunched shoulders made her wonder if he was trying to escape more than the confines of the house. Eleanor wrapped a thick shawl around herself and stepped outside, the cold air biting her cheeks. The snow crunched underfoot as she followed Finn's path. When she reached him, he was crouched near the edge of the forest, his pencil moving furiously across the paper. She paused, observing him from a distance. His focus was intense, his hands sweeping in fluid motions as he captured something on the page. "What are you drawing?" she asked, breaking the silence. Finn startled slightly but didn't look up. "The trees," he said simply, "or at least, the way they seem to lean toward the house. Like they're watching it." Eleanor glanced at the sketch. It was hauntingly beautiful, the trees twisted unnaturally, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward Wintermere. "You have an eye for the unsettling," she said, shivering as she pulled her shawl tighter. "Do you always see the world this way?" Finn finally looked up, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Maybe. Or maybe it's this place. It gets under your skin, makes you notice things you'd rather ignore." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to respond. She couldn't deny that Wintermere had a way of amplifying her fears, her doubts. Even now, she felt as though the house, or whatever force lingered within it, was watching them both. "I read more of the journal," she said after a moment. "Margaret wrote about a crime of the heart. Do you think that's what started the curse?" Finn's expression darkened. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just another piece of the puzzle." Whoever Margaret was, she clearly knew more than she was letting on. Eleanor nodded, her mind churning. "We need to find out more about her, about what happened here. If the curse is real, maybe there's a way to break it." Finn's lips quirked into a wry smile. "And here I thought you didn't believe in curses." "I don't," she said quickly. "But whatever's happening here, it's not normal. And I'm not leaving until I figure it out." The day stretched on, the snow glittering in the weak sunlight. Finn returned to his sketching, while Eleanor delved deeper into the manor's hidden corners. She started with the library, combing through dusty shelves and forgotten cabinets. Most of what she found was mundane. Old ledgers, family records, weathered books that crumbled at her touch. But as the afternoon waned, she stumbled upon a locked chest tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain. The chest was small but sturdy, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Eleanor's fingers brushed over the intricate carvings on its surface. Roses intertwined with thorns, their stems curling into patterns that seemed almost alive. She felt a strange pull, as though the chest was calling to her. After several minutes of searching, she found a rusty key hidden in a nearby drawer. Her heart raced as she slid it into the lock and turned. The mechanism groaned in protest, but eventually gave way. Inside, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, their edges yellowed with time. She sat on the floor and began to read, her breath catching as she absorbed the words. The letters were written by Margaret Caldwell, addressed to someone named E. They spoke of love, passionate, desperate, forbidden love. But they also spoke of betrayal and heartbreak. December 15th, 1847, my dearest E. I cannot bear the weight of this secret any longer. If only the world would allow us to be together, free from judgment and scorn. But fate has been cruel, and my heart breaks with every passing day. I fear that our love will be the ruin of us both. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. The letters grew darker, more frantic, culminating in a final, chilling note. December 23rd, 1847, E. It is done. The bond we shared has been severed, and the price was greater than I could have imagined. Wintermere will never be the same. Forgive me, if you can, for I cannot forgive myself. Eleanor sat back, her mind reeling. The date, December 23rd, was only 2 days away. Whatever had happened on that fateful night more than a century ago, it had left a scar that still lingered. Eleanor? She jumped, clutching the letters to her chest. Finn stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. What did you find? He asked, stepping closer. She hesitated, then handed him the bundle. Finn's eyes scanned the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. When he looked up, there was a flicker of something. Anger? Fear? She couldn't tell. Do you think E was the cause of the curse? She asked. I think, Finn said slowly, that whatever happened between Margaret and this E, it didn't end well. And if we're not careful, history might repeat itself. Eleanor shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words. The secrets of Wintermere were coming to light, but with each revelation, the danger seemed to grow. And as the snow continued to fall, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Chapter 8. Under the Mistletoe. The days after the holiday rush seemed to pass in a blur. Pinebrook was still wrapped in a soft blanket of snow, the town glowing in the early morning light. For Eleanor, the holiday season had been a whirlwind of emotions. There were moments of joy, yes, but also a lot of uncertainty. Finn had been on her mind constantly since their unexpected kiss under the mistletoe. A kiss that had sparked a series of feelings Eleanor wasn't quite ready to confront. She found herself replaying that moment in her head over and over, wondering what it meant for them. The spark between them had been undeniable, but Eleanor wasn't sure if she was ready to let herself feel that way about someone again. The fear of getting hurt lingered, no matter how much Finn seemed to care. The town of Pinebrook had returned to its slow rhythm after the holidays. People went about their days in the usual small-town way, greeting each other with warmth, but not the frenetic energy that had marked the Christmas season. Eleanor felt the quiet settling around her, and for the first time in days, she found herself enjoying the stillness. One morning, as she opened the cafe for another busy day, she heard the familiar sound of the bell above the door ringing. She looked up to find Finn standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, his breath visible in the cold air behind him. A small, nervous smile played at the corners of his lips as he met her gaze. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but steady. Eleanor felt her heart flutter at the sight of him. She hadn't seen him since the night of the Christmas party, and the tension that had built between them was still palpable. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It wasn't like they were strangers. They were friends, after all. Yet, everything felt different now. "Morning," she replied, forcing a smile. "You're up early." Finn shrugged, his smile widening a bit. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd stop by for some coffee." Eleanor nodded and turned to prepare his order, trying to focus on the task at hand. She couldn't help but notice how he stood there, watching her, as though he was waiting for something. The silence between them stretched, neither of them speaking, but both of them knowing that something important needed to be said. When she handed him his coffee, their fingers brushed briefly, and for a moment, Eleanor felt that spark again. She met his gaze, and for a heartbeat, she wondered if he felt it too. "So," Finn began, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about that night." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and she set the coffee pot down, wiping her hands on her apron as she looked at him. "Finn, I just want to make sure we're on the same page," he continued, his voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability. "What happened under the mistletoe? That kiss? I don't want to make things awkward between us, but I don't want to pretend it didn't happen either." Eleanor's stomach fluttered, and she couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and fear. The air between them had been thick with unsaid words for days, and now here they were, finally talking about it. She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I'm just not sure what it means. We've been friends for so long, and I don't want to mess that up. But I can't ignore how I felt in that moment." Finn nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want to mess things up either," he said quietly. "But I also don't want to pretend that I don't care about you, Eleanor. I've cared about you for a long time." His words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Finn had cared about her for a long time? She had known there was something between them, something more than friendship, but hearing him say it out loud was a different thing entirely. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her heart racing. "I don't want to lose what we have, but I don't want to keep pretending that I'm not feeling something more than just friendship." Finn took a step closer, his gaze tender but steady. "We don't have to figure it all out right now, Eleanor, but I don't want to hide how I feel about you anymore." The sincerity in his eyes made Eleanor's chest tighten. She had been afraid of what would happen if they took this step, afraid of what it could mean for their friendship, but standing here now, she realized that the only thing she feared more than the unknown was the idea of losing him altogether. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "I don't want to lose you either, Finn," she whispered. I think I'm ready to see where this could go." A relieved smile broke across Finn's face, and he reached out to gently take her hand in his. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice full of warmth and hope. Eleanor nodded, her heart lifting. "I'm sure." And in that moment, everything seemed to shift. The air between them no longer felt heavy with uncertainty. Instead, there was a new kind of lightness, a sense of possibility that filled the space around them. The friendship that had always been the foundation of their relationship was still there, but now there was something more. Something that held the promise of a future neither of them had expected. Finn squeezed her hand gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "This doesn't change everything, you know? We take it slow together." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "Together," she echoed. The days ahead would bring new challenges and questions, of course. There would be moments of doubt, of second-guessing. But for now, in this moment, there was only certainty. A certainty that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Chapter 9. Echoes of Love Lost. The days following their conversation at the cafe felt like a slow but steady transition into a new chapter for Eleanor and Finn. The unspoken tension that had once filled the air between them had dissipated, leaving behind a comfortable warmth. There were still moments of hesitation, moments when Eleanor wondered if they were rushing things, or if they were making the right choices. But those moments were fleeting. Every time she looked at Finn, something inside her assured her that they were moving in the right direction. It was an odd feeling, moving forward with someone after years of friendship. She had never thought it possible that something more could grow between them, not after all the years of being just friends. But here they were, each step taken carefully, with both of them aware of the magnitude of what they were beginning. Finn had become a constant presence in her days, and Eleanor couldn't deny that she was beginning to enjoy the way their relationship was evolving. The quiet mornings at the cafe, the shared glances, the soft laughter, all felt different, yet strangely familiar. It was like they had known all along that this was where they were meant to be, even if it had taken a little time to get there. It was a Saturday morning when they found themselves at the local farmer's market, something Eleanor had always enjoyed but never fully experienced with someone else. The market was bustling with activity, as it always was on weekends. Stalls lined the streets, filled with fresh produce, homemade jams, hand-knitted scarves, and 1,000 other little treasures that made Pinebrook feel like a place suspended in time. People greeted each other with warmth, and the air was filled with the sense of baked goods, fresh flowers, and the crispness of early spring. Eleanor and Finn walked through the market hand in hand, her fingers intertwined with his, their steps in sync. It wasn't crowded yet, so they had the space to roam freely, taking in the sights and sounds. There was a certain joy to it, a carefree atmosphere that made Eleanor feel like they were discovering this part of their town together for the first time. "I've never actually bought anything here before," Eleanor said, glancing at a stall full of colorful vegetables. "I always just pass by." Finn smiled at her, his thumb gently brushing over her hand. "We should fix that. Maybe we can pick out something to make for dinner tonight." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Dinner? What do you have in mind?" Finn grinned. "I don't know yet. Something simple, maybe. How about we get some ingredients and try cooking together?" The idea of cooking with Finn made Eleanor feel a warm rush of excitement. She had always enjoyed cooking, but it had always been a solitary activity for her. The thought of sharing it with someone, especially him, felt both new and comfortable at the same time. "That sounds nice," she agreed, smiling up at him. "I think I could get used to this." As they walked through the market, Finn stopped at a stall selling handmade candles. He picked up a small lavender-scented one and held it out to Eleanor. "For the dinner table," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Eleanor took the candle from him, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "This is perfect," she said, feeling the weight of the gesture settle in her heart. It wasn't just a candle. It was a symbol of the small, thoughtful ways Finn had been showing her that he cared. They continued to wander, picking out fresh vegetables, herbs, and a loaf of crusty bread. By the time they made their way to the flower stall, their basket was already half full. The scent of blooming roses and lilacs filled the air, and Eleanor couldn't help but smile as Finn picked out a small bouquet of wildflowers, handing them to her with a soft look in his eyes. "Are you trying to spoil me?" she teased, tucking the flowers into her basket. Finn's smile deepened. "I just want to make sure you know I'm serious about this, Eleanor." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. She had always known that Finn was sincere, but hearing him say it out loud, in such a simple yet meaningful way, made everything feel so much more real. "Well, I'm serious about this too," she replied, her voice soft but steady. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and quiet moments of connection. They made their way home, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the streets of Pinebrook. By the time they arrived at Eleanor's house, they were both excited to begin preparing their meal together. Finn had offered to take the lead with the cooking, and Eleanor was more than happy to let him. She watched as he chopped vegetables, his movements confident and sure. There was something comforting about the way he moved in her kitchen, like he had done it 1,000 times before. It wasn't just the cooking. It was the way he made everything feel easy, effortless, even when they were still learning about each other in this new context. As the aroma of their dinner filled the air, Eleanor set the table, arranging the flowers Finn had bought her in the center as a centerpiece. The candle flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the room. They sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed just as easily as it always had. They talked about everything and nothing: work, the town, their families, and even their dreams for the future. The ease between them felt natural, like this was how things had always been meant to be. After dinner, they cleaned up together, moving in sync as they washed dishes and put everything away. When the last plate was dried and put in its place, Finn turned to Eleanor, his expression soft. "You know," he began, his voice quieter now, "I've been thinking about how we've come so far, how much has changed between us in such a short time. But it feels right. It feels like this is where we're supposed to be." Eleanor felt her heart swell at his words. She had been thinking the same thing. Everything between them had changed, but in the best way. There were still things they needed to figure out, of course, but for the first time, Eleanor felt confident that they were heading in the right direction. "It does feel right," she agreed, her voice full of warmth. "And I'm glad we're doing this, Finn. I'm glad we're taking this step together." He smiled, stepping closer to her. "Together," he echoed, and as they stood there in the soft light of her kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of their shared moments, Eleanor realized that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it, with Finn by her side. Chapter 10: A Canvas of Secrets. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance between comfort and anticipation. Eleanor and Finn's relationship, though still new, felt like it had always been destined to happen. The ease with which they slid into this new phase of their friendship was almost magical, like they were meant to take this step at exactly this moment in time. Still, Eleanor couldn't shake the occasional feeling of uncertainty, wondering if their connection could survive the trials that might come with it. Each day with Finn brought a new discovery. They laughed together more freely than before, shared quiet evenings, and supported each other through the small challenges that life always seemed to present. Yet, even as things felt perfect in so many ways, Eleanor's mind sometimes drifted to the larger questions. What would it mean for them to take this all the way? To make it more than a shared glance or a soft kiss? Was she truly ready for everything that came with being fully vulnerable with him? It was a Wednesday evening when Eleanor found herself lost in thought once again. The cafe was nearly empty, the late winter chill keeping most of the town's residents indoors. The dim lights cast a gentle glow over the room, and the soft hum of the radio in the background created a peaceful atmosphere. Eleanor was wiping down the counter when she felt a familiar presence beside her. She glanced up to find Finn standing there, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his jacket, and there was a small smile on his face. "Hey," he greeted softly, as if he had all the time in the world. He always had a way of making her feel like the most important person in any room. "Hey yourself," she replied, unable to stop the warmth from spreading across her face. She hadn't seen him all day, and the sight of him instantly lifted her spirits. Finn leaned against the counter, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke. "How's your day been?" he asked, his tone easy but tinged with a quiet curiosity. He always asked with that same sincerity, like he truly wanted to know. Eleanor paused, running a cloth over the counter as she considered his question. "Busy," she said after a moment. "The usual rush of customers, but now it's quieter. Just the way I like it." Finn nodded, looking around the cafe. "I'm glad you're getting some downtime. You deserve it." "Thanks," she said, smiling at him. She could feel the way his gaze rested on her. There was something deeper in it lately, something that made her heart flutter. He wasn't just looking at her as a friend anymore. He was looking at her with the kind of quiet affection that only someone who cared deeply could show. There was a brief silence before Finn broke it, his voice lower than before. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about us. About everything." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at the seriousness in his tone. She set the cloth down, her attention now fully on him. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady, though a nervous fluttering had begun in her chest. Finn met her gaze, his eyes warm but also filled with something else, something more vulnerable. "I guess I'm just thinking about how easy it feels with you, how right it feels. But at the same time, I don't want us to rush into anything. I want us to really understand what we're doing here." Eleanor felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected him to voice what she'd been silently wondering herself. The truth was, even though things between them felt natural, she had been carrying her own doubts. She wasn't sure what exactly she was afraid of. Perhaps it was the idea of getting too comfortable, too secure, only to face the possibility of something falling apart. "I understand," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about the same thing. I don't want us to rush either. I want to be sure. But I also don't want to let fear stand in the way of what could be something really good." Finn stepped closer, his eyes not leaving hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. I just want to make sure we're on the same page." There was something about his words, something so sincere, that made her feel like she could breathe again. This wasn't just about their chemistry or the thrill of a new romance. It was about taking the time to understand each other fully, to build something that was strong enough to last. "I think we are on the same page," she said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I don't know where this is going yet, but I know I want to take the time to find out." Finn smiled back, that familiar warmth returning to his eyes. "Me too. I think that's all we can do right now. Just take it one day at a time." Eleanor nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The uncertainty that had lingered between them seemed to melt away in that moment. They didn't need to have all the answers right now. They just needed to be honest with each other and with themselves. As they stood there, in the quiet glow of the cafe, Eleanor realized that this was exactly what she had been hoping for. A relationship built on trust, communication, and the willingness to be vulnerable. It was exactly what she needed, and maybe even more than she deserved. "Okay," she said softly. "One day at a time." Finn's smile deepened, and without a word, he reached out to take her hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. His way of saying that he was in this with her, just as she was in it with him. The next few weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. They spent time together in the evenings, sometimes with quiet dinners at her house, other times going for long walks through Pinebrook's peaceful streets. They continued to get to know each other, layer by layer, sharing memories and dreams they had never spoken of before. It felt as though they were starting from the beginning, but this time, the foundation was stronger. There was no rushing, no pressure, just a mutual understanding that they would figure it out as they went along. And so they did. Eleanor and Finn's bond grew stronger with each passing day, not because they had figured everything out, but because they were willing to face it all together, whatever it may be. Chapter 11. The cracks begin to show. Spring had arrived in Pinebrook, and with it, a new sense of hope. The town was waking up from the winter slumber that had held it in its quiet grasp for so long. The air was crisp and fresh, the flowers were beginning to bloom, and the days were growing longer, brighter. Everything felt like it was on the verge of something new, and Eleanor could feel it too. Her relationship with Finn had deepened over the past few weeks, and despite the occasional flicker of doubt that still lingered in her mind, she couldn't help but feel that this was where she was supposed to be. They had spent most of their time in a bubble of comfort, enjoying each other's company, exploring the town, and taking things slow. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. And sometimes that was enough. It was one evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, that things began to shift again. Eleanor had just finished closing the cafe for the night and was preparing to head home when Finn walked in. He seemed more serious than usual, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about him tonight. "Hey," she greeted, trying to read his expression as he stood at the door. "Hey," Finn replied, his voice a little quieter than usual. He glanced around the cafe briefly before meeting her eyes. "Can we talk?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The way he said it, so carefully, so deliberately, made her stomach tighten with apprehension. She nodded, setting the rag down on the counter. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Finn took a deep breath, walking over to her slowly. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. She had learned to expect the unexpected with Finn, but something about tonight felt different, like they were about to reach a turning point. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he started. His gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before he looked up at her. "About us. About where we're headed." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Finn, what are you saying?" He paused for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to hold back. I think we both know that we're not just friends anymore, Eleanor, and I don't want to keep dancing around what we feel. I want to know if we're really ready for this, for whatever comes next." Eleanor stood there, frozen. She had known this conversation was coming eventually, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Finn's words echoed in her mind, and she felt a whirlwind of emotions tugging at her. She wanted to take the next step, to move forward with him, but there was still a part of her that wasn't sure. The fear that had always followed her, the uncertainty of what a relationship with Finn would mean. Was she truly ready to dive into it? I don't know," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "I think I do want that, Finn. I think I want more. But I'm scared. What if we end up ruining everything? What if it doesn't work out?" Finn's face softened at her words, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "Eleanor, I don't want to mess things up either, but I don't think we'll ever know unless we try. And we won't know unless we're both all in." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had spent so long protecting herself from the possibility of heartache, convincing herself that staying safe was the better choice. But now, standing here with Finn, she realized that the real risk wasn't in giving herself fully to him. It was in not taking the chance at all. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. "I'm willing to try," she whispered, her voice steady. "I'm willing to see where this goes with you." A soft smile tugged at Finn's lips, and the tension in his shoulders seemed to lift. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close as though he never wanted to let go. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their unspoken understanding hanging between them. There were no more doubts, no more second-guessing. They had made their decision, together. As they pulled away, Finn's eyes sparkled with something that made Eleanor's heart flutter. "You don't know how happy that makes me," he said, his voice filled with relief and something else, something deeper. Eleanor smiled back, her heart light. "I'm happy too," she admitted, "but I think we need to take it slow. I don't want to rush into anything. I think we've got something good here, and I don't want to lose that." Finn nodded, his hand still resting gently on her arm. "We'll take it slow, Eleanor. I promise." And just like that, they had crossed a threshold, one that would change everything. But Eleanor knew, deep down, that they had made the right choice. It wasn't going to be easy. Relationships never were. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to take the plunge. The next few days passed in a blur of newness and quiet excitement. Eleanor and Finn spent more time together than ever before, going on walks, sharing meals, and learning new things about each other with every conversation. It was as though they were rediscovering each other all over again, and every moment felt significant. Still, even as their bond grew stronger, Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming. There were moments of happiness, yes, but there were also moments of doubt. She found herself wondering if they were truly as prepared for this as they thought they were. The reality of being in a relationship wasn't always as simple as the idealized version she had imagined. There were compromises to be made, fears to confront, and uncertainties to navigate. But for now, Eleanor chose to focus on the present. The joy of being with Finn, of discovering what they were building together, of feeling something real for the first time in years. She didn't know where this would take them, but she was determined to take each step with him, one day at a time. Chapter 12, Haunted by Firelight. As spring blossomed into full swing, Pinebrook seemed to come alive in ways that had once felt impossible during the cold, dark months of winter. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and the town itself felt like it was shedding its old skin, much like Eleanor herself. There was a certain magic to the season, a feeling of possibility that hung in the air, something that made every moment seem full of promise. Yet, despite the outward beauty of the world around her, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the subtle distance between her and Finn. It wasn't something either of them had discussed directly, but it was there. She noticed it in the way they spent less time together, how their conversations seemed more stilted, and how their moments of connection now felt almost fleeting. It was an odd, unsettling feeling, like something they both sensed but didn't quite know how to address. Every time she tried to talk to Finn about it, the words seemed to stick in her throat, and when he looked at her, there was always a slight hesitation in his eyes, as if he were afraid to say the wrong thing. Their relationship had started with such ease, with such certainty, and now, it was as if they were both unsure of what had changed. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself sitting alone in the cafe, lost in thought. The warm sun streamed in through the large windows, casting a soft glow on the tables and the few customers who were scattered around the room. She had just finished cleaning up after the lunch rush and was taking a quiet moment for herself, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. It wasn't that she didn't care about Finn. she did. More than she had ever cared about anyone before. But lately, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't an easy thing to explain, but there were moments when she felt like they were walking on different paths, each one leading to a place the other wasn't sure they wanted to go. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the door opening. She looked up to see Finn standing there, his hands in his pockets, a hesitant look on his face. Her heart gave a little jump, but the warmth she usually felt at the sight of him was tempered by that same nagging sense of unease. "Hey," he said softly, offering her a small smile. "Hey?" Eleanor replied, trying to hide the flicker of disappointment that crossed her face. She couldn't help but notice how different his smile seemed these days. Less genuine, more guarded. "How's your day been?" "Busy," Finn answered, his voice distracted. He took a few steps toward her, then stopped, his eyes avoiding hers. "Look, Eleanor, I think we need to talk." Her stomach dropped at the words, her pulse quickening. She knew this conversation was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. "Okay," she said quietly, setting her coffee cup down. "What about?" Finn glanced around, as though unsure whether to continue. But then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. "I don't know. I feel like something's off between us lately. I can't shake the feeling that we're drifting apart, and I don't know what to do about it." Eleanor's heart tightened in her chest. She had felt it too, but hearing him say it aloud made it all the more painful. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been feeling it too. I don't want to lose what we have, Finn, but it feels like we're both holding back." Finn ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I don't want to hold back. I really don't, but I don't know how to fix it. We've always been able to talk through things before, but now it feels like everything's changing and we can't keep up with it." Eleanor felt her chest tighten, and she fought to keep her emotions in check. This wasn't how she had imagined things would go. Not after everything they'd been through, not after the promises they had made to each other. But it was happening, and it felt like they were both helpless in the face of it. "I don't know what's happening either," she said softly. "I don't know if it's just that we're in different places right now, or if we're just not what we thought we were." Finn looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Some kind of answer that she wasn't sure she had. "Do you think it's over?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat at the question. She hadn't expected him to ask that, not directly. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "I don't want it to be over, but I don't want to keep pretending either. We can't just ignore what's happening between us." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. Eleanor could feel her heart aching, torn between the desire to hold on to Finn and the realization that sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Finally, Finn took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "Maybe we just need some space," he said softly. "Maybe we need to take a step back and figure out what we really want." Eleanor nodded, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. "Maybe," she whispered, "maybe that's what we need." The conversation ended there, both of them too exhausted by the emotional weight of it to say anything more. They didn't exchange any grand gestures of affection, no promises of tomorrow. Instead, they both stood there, silently acknowledging the fragile state of their relationship. As Finn left the cafe that day, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar emptiness settle in her chest. It wasn't the end, not yet, but it was a beginning, a new chapter that neither of them had been prepared for. There was still love between them, but love alone couldn't fill the space that had grown between their hearts. And as Eleanor watched Finn walk away, she couldn't help but wonder if the distance between them was something they could ever bridge again. Chapter 13. Shattered Veils. The following weeks were a blur for Eleanor. After that quiet, painful conversation with Finn, she felt like she was walking through life with a fog surrounding her. Every moment seemed a little more distant, as though she were no longer part of her own story. She threw herself into her work at the cafe, hoping that the constant rhythm of steaming coffee, bustling customers, and friendly chatter would fill the silence that had begun to seep into her life. But nothing seemed to help. She couldn't stop thinking about Finn, about what they had been, about what they could still be. He had backed away, needing space, and Eleanor had done the same. Even though every fiber of her being longed for him to pull her close again, she missed the way he made her laugh, the quiet moments they'd shared, the feeling of being understood without words. It was a loss she hadn't anticipated. One crisp afternoon, as the golden light of autumn began to soften the edges of the town, Eleanor found herself walking down Pinebrook's main street, her thoughts drifting from one place to another. She passed by the small shops she had come to know well, the bookshop with the creaky door, the bakery with its deliciously sweet smells wafting out onto the street, the park bench where she and Finn had once sat, laughing together. It was as though every corner of the town held a piece of him, and yet everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. It had been nearly a month since their conversation, and while they hadn't officially broken up, the space between them felt just as wide as any gulf of distance could. Neither of them had made the first move to reconcile. They had both retreated into their separate worlds, hoping that time would somehow heal the growing ache they both felt. But as she walked past the familiar bench by the park, she saw something that made her pause. Finn. He was sitting there, a book in his hands, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They were distant, lost in thought, just as she often felt. He hadn't noticed her yet, and for a moment, Eleanor stood frozen, unsure of whether to approach or turn around and keep walking. But her feet seemed to move on their own, carrying her closer to him. As she got closer, Finn finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers with the same surprise she felt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words. Eleanor stopped a few feet away, the sunlight casting a soft glow on Finn's face. There was a hesitation in his eyes, a wariness that she hadn't seen before. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice tentative. "Hey," Finn replied, his voice low and uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't either," Eleanor admitted, offering a faint smile. "I was just walking. Needed to clear my head, I guess." There was a long pause as they both stood there, unsure of how to proceed. Eleanor could feel the weight of everything unsaid, everything left in limbo between them. She wanted to say something, anything, that would bridge the gap, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, it was Finn who broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his gaze softening as he met her eyes. "About us. About everything." Eleanor felt her chest tighten, her heart fluttering. She hadn't expected him to be the one to speak first, but now that he had, she realized just how much she had been waiting for this moment. She nodded, her voice quiet. "I've been thinking about it too." Another pause. This time, Finn set the book down beside him and stood, taking a step toward her. "I've missed you, Eleanor," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I miss us. I know we've been apart, and I hate it. But I don't want us to just drift away without at least trying to figure things out." The sincerity in his voice made Eleanor's heart ache. She had missed him too, more than she had allowed herself to admit. "I've missed you too," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't want to lose you, Finn." They stood there for a moment, the air between them still heavy with the weight of the past few weeks. But in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't immediate, nor was it perfect, but it was real. They both understood now that the distance that had grown between them wasn't something they could ignore forever. It had to be addressed. "I think we've both been scared," Eleanor said finally, the words coming out more clearly than she expected. "Scared of what happens next. Scared of what we might lose. But I don't think we can keep running from it." Finn nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think you're right," he agreed, his voice steady. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to figure this out with you, Eleanor. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm willing to try. Are you?" Eleanor's heart swelled in her chest, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "I want to try too." And just like that, something in the air seemed to change. The heaviness that had plagued them both started to lift, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. They weren't out of the woods yet, and there was still so much to figure out. But in this moment, standing there in the fading sunlight, they both knew that they weren't ready to give up on each other. Not yet. Finn took a step closer, closing the small gap between them. He reached out tentatively, his hand brushing against hers. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She took his hand in hers, holding it firmly, the warmth of his touch grounding her. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. It was the first step toward finding their way back to each other. "I think we've both learned a lot in the time we've been apart," Finn said softly, his thumb brushing gently over her hand. "And I think we can make it through this. Together." Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with something she hadn't realized she'd been craving all along. "Together," she echoed. "I think we can too." They stood there for a few more moments, just holding hands, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. There was still a lot of work ahead of them, but in that moment, they had rediscovered the one thing that had always brought them together: the willingness to try, to fight for what they had. And as they walked back down the path together, side by side, Eleanor felt a new sense of hope rise in her chest. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were still plenty of bumps in the road ahead. But for the first time in a long while, she was no longer afraid of the future. Because whatever it held, they would face it together. Chapter 14. The Turning of the Tide. The days that followed were filled with the kind of quiet reconciliation Eleanor and Finn had longed for. They didn't rush back into each other's lives with the same intensity they had once shared. Instead, they took things slowly, giving each other space to breathe, yet finding their way back to the little routines and moments that had always made them feel like a team. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor woke up each morning with a sense of hope, a quiet confidence that perhaps they had turned a corner, one they hadn't realized they needed to turn until they were already deep into the journey. Their bond had shifted, but it hadn't broken. There was still something strong between them, something worth nurturing. One evening, as the crisp air of fall began to settle over Pinebrook, Finn invited Eleanor to dinner at a small, intimate restaurant by the lake. It wasn't anything extravagant, but the idea of it was enough to stir something warm inside her. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to reconnect in a way that wasn't weighed down by the past. When she arrived, Finn was already there, waiting by the window. His smile when he saw her sent a ripple of warmth through her. His eyes no longer carried the same hesitation they had before. Now, there was a quiet steadiness in them, as though he had made peace with what had come before and was ready to look forward. "Hey," he said, standing up as she approached. "You look great." Eleanor smiled, a little shyly. "Thanks. You do too." They shared a brief, comfortable hug, and as they sat down at the table, the conversation flowed easily between them. It wasn't as if everything was suddenly perfect, or that they were pretending the past didn't exist. But there was something undeniable in the way they could laugh together, in the way their eyes met and lingered just a moment longer than necessary. The cracks that had formed in their relationship were still there, but they were beginning to fill in with something stronger, something more resilient. "So," Finn began, after a pause, his fork resting on his plate. "How's work at the cafe? I've been meaning to stop by and see you." Eleanor shrugged, taking a sip of her wine. "It's been busy. The holidays are starting to pick up, and with the weather getting colder, more people are coming in for their hot chocolate fix." Finn nodded, his gaze focused on her. "That sounds nice. I've missed those little things. Your smile when you're behind the counter, the way you take your time with everything, making sure it's perfect." Her heart gave a little skip at his words. She hadn't realized how much she missed those simple moments when he saw her, really saw her, and appreciated the small details of who she was. "I've missed that too," she admitted, her voice softening. "I didn't realize how much until things got complicated." Finn reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. "I'm sorry for the distance, Eleanor. I should have done more to fix things sooner. But I'm here now, and I want to be here. For you. For us." She met his gaze, her heart swelling with emotion. "I know, Finn. I know." The evening continued with gentle conversation, laughter, and moments of silence that felt comfortable, not awkward. They shared a dessert, a rich chocolate cake that they both agreed was far too decadent, but too delicious to resist. When the meal ended, Finn paid the bill, and they walked outside together, the cool breeze lifting their hair and causing their breath to puff out in little clouds in the crisp night air. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something they had both longed for, the simple, easy connection that had been missing for so long. As they walked along the quiet street toward the parking lot, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers right away. Maybe it was about finding the courage to take things one step at a time, to trust that even after the uncertainty, there was still a foundation strong enough to stand on. Finn stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice serious but filled with warmth, "that maybe we could plan a little trip together, somewhere quiet, just the two of us, away from everything. A chance to really reconnect. What do you think?" Eleanor's heart fluttered at the thought. A trip, a getaway to somewhere peaceful, where they could focus on each other without the distractions of everyday life. It sounded perfect. It sounded like exactly what they needed. "I'd love that," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "Where were you thinking?" Finn grinned, clearly relieved by her response. "Somewhere with mountains. Or the ocean. Maybe both, if we're lucky. But I don't know. We could decide together. Wherever feels right." Eleanor felt a sense of excitement building inside her, a reminder that they weren't just treading water anymore. They were moving forward, together, and it felt like the beginning of something new. The rest of the night passed in a haze of quiet conversation, comfortable silences, and the kind of soft, easy affection that only comes when two people are truly at ease with each other. When they finally parted ways, the promise of the trip, the promise of time spent together, lingered between them. As Eleanor drove home that night, she thought about the journey she had been on. It wasn't a perfect path, and it hadn't been without its challenges. But maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand that love wasn't always about the perfect moments or the smoothest road. It was about the willingness to keep moving forward, to trust each other even when things were uncertain, and to find joy in the journey itself. And as she pulled into her driveway, the lights of the house casting a soft glow on the quiet street, Eleanor realized something else too. The Christmas mistletoe that had sparked their first kiss so many months ago, so many twists of fate ago, no longer felt like a symbol of awkwardness or uncertainty. Instead, it was a reminder that even in the most unexpected of moments, love had found its way to them. Chapter 15. The Curse Unbound. The weeks following their dinner by the lake were filled with a quiet kind of magic. Eleanor and Finn's relationship had taken on a new rhythm, one that was less hurried, more thoughtful. They weren't rushing back into anything, but rather letting things grow naturally. Slowly, carefully, they began rebuilding their trust in each other, piece by piece. They spent weekends exploring the town together, walking through the crisp streets of Pinebrook, hand in hand. They laughed about the little things, how Finn still couldn't remember which way to stir the coffee at the cafe, or how Eleanor always tried to fix his disorganized bookshelf, even though she knew he liked it that way. These small moments were what grounded them, and slowly, the heavy weight of their past misunderstandings seemed to lift. As they grew more comfortable, their conversations began to stretch further than the simple pleasantries of everyday life. They spoke about their hopes for the future, the kind of life they imagined for themselves, and the places they still wanted to see. It was in these quiet moments that Eleanor realized how much they still had to discover about each other. One crisp Saturday afternoon, after a walk through the park, Finn brought up the trip he had suggested a few weeks ago. "So, I was thinking," he began, his voice casual, but there was something in his tone that made Eleanor pause. She looked at him, curious. "What's on your mind?" "I've been looking at places for that getaway we talked about," Finn said. "I found a few spots. Some are close by, others are a bit further. What do you think?" Eleanor felt her excitement stir again. The idea of going away together, having time just for the two of them, was something she hadn't realized she needed so much. "I think it's a great idea," she said, her voice warm with anticipation. "Where were you thinking?" Finn grinned, and for a moment, Eleanor could see the spark of excitement in his eyes. "How about a cabin in the mountains? I found one up north. It's cozy, secluded, a perfect place to relax, but also close enough for a little adventure if we want it." Eleanor couldn't help but smile. The thought of being in a quiet cabin with Finn, surrounded by the beauty of nature, sounded perfect. "I love it," she said. "Let's do it." They spent the next few days planning the trip together, deciding what to pack, what activities they wanted to do, and which roads to take. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to create new memories, memories that weren't haunted by misunderstandings or missteps, but built on trust and the bond they were carefully nurturing. When the weekend of their trip finally arrived, the weather was crisp and cold, a perfect setting for a mountain retreat. They packed up Finn's car, throwing in everything they might need: warm sweaters, hiking boots, a cooler filled with snacks, and a stack of books they both had been wanting to read. The anticipation of the journey ahead felt like a soft, glowing warmth between them. The drive was quiet at first, both of them caught in their thoughts, the landscape unfolding in patches of snowy hills and towering trees. But as the miles passed and the roads grew narrower, their conversation flowed more easily. They spoke about everything and nothing, about the books they loved, about their favorite songs, about their families and how their childhoods had shaped them into who they were. It was on that drive, as they shared stories and laughter, that Eleanor realized just how far they had come. There had been a time not so long ago when they weren't sure if they could even find their way back to each other. Yet, here they were, on a journey, both literally and figuratively, learning how to trust again, how to let go of the fear of what might happen and simply enjoy what was right in front of them. As they neared the cabin, the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The sight of the small, rustic cabin nestled in the snow-covered woods felt like stepping into a dream. It was simple but beautiful, just the kind of place they had hoped for. They unpacked quickly, the excitement of being in this secluded spot making everything feel more special. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The air inside smelled of wood and pine, and the warmth of the fire made the cold outside feel like a distant memory. As night fell, they sat together on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, sipping hot cocoa. The world outside felt miles away, and Eleanor felt as though everything was right in that moment. Finn's arm was around her, his presence grounding her, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to simply be present. "I'm glad we're here," Finn said softly, his voice almost a whisper as he brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Eleanor smiled, the words she'd been holding back finally slipping free. "Me too. I didn't realize how much I needed this until now." Finn kissed the top of her head, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire and the sound of their breathing the only things in the room. There were still unanswered questions, still moments of uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, Eleanor didn't feel afraid of what the future might hold. She knew they would face it together, one step at a time. The rest of their time at the cabin was filled with quiet mornings, long walks in the snow, and nights spent by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't a grand escape, but it was everything they needed. A chance to slow down, to rediscover the joy in each other's company, and to remind themselves that they were on the same path, walking toward the same future. By the time they left, the bond between them felt deeper, more secure. They had learned something important during their time away, that love wasn't just about the good moments, but about the way they supported each other through the hard ones, the way they learned to communicate, to trust, and to grow together. As they drove back to Pinebrook, the mountain roads now behind them, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. They weren't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, she was sure of one thing. They were building something real, something worth fighting for. And as they crossed the town's border, heading back into the familiar streets of Pinebrook, Eleanor smiled. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but she was ready for whatever came next, with Finn by her side. Chapter 16. The Storm Within. The days after their mountain getaway were filled with a new sense of ease. It was as though the weight of uncertainty had been lifted, leaving behind the quiet, steady comfort of knowing they had rediscovered each other. Eleanor and Finn had learned something important about themselves during the trip, that their love wasn't just about the big moments, but also about the quiet, everyday ones that made up the rhythm of their lives. They didn't need grand gestures to make their relationship work. They needed trust, patience, and time. Back in Pinebrook, the town was settling into the gentle pace of winter. Snowflakes continued to fall in soft, swirling patterns, covering the streets in a thick blanket of white. The days were short, the nights long, but there was a certain peacefulness that came with the season. People had begun to prepare for the holidays, hanging wreaths and lights on their homes, and there was a collective sense of anticipation in the air. Eleanor found herself spending more time at the cafe, but this time, it wasn't because she felt trapped or overwhelmed. It was because she wanted to be there. She found joy in the simple act of making lattes and serving pastries, of seeing familiar faces walk through the door and sharing little moments of connection with them. It was a place of warmth, both literally and figuratively, and it felt like home in a way that was grounding. Finn, too, seemed to be settling into his life with a new sense of purpose. He had always been someone who loved the town and its rhythms, but there was a newfound spark in him, one that had been rekindled by the time they spent together, away from the pressures of their past. He had started volunteering more, helping with local events, and even offering to teach some music lessons to the kids in town. It was clear that he had found a sense of fulfillment in giving back to the community, something that had always been a part of who he was, but had been buried under the weight of everything else for a while. They had begun to create new routines together. Some mornings, they would meet for coffee before work, sharing a quiet moment before the day began. Other nights, they would cook dinner together, experimenting with new recipes or simply making their favorite comfort foods. These were the moments that mattered, the simple, ordinary moments that didn't need to be special to be meaningful. One Sunday afternoon, as the first signs of Christmas began to appear in the town square, Finn and Eleanor found themselves walking through the market. The air was crisp, and the smell of roasted chestnuts and hot cider filled the streets. It was the kind of place that felt magical during the holidays, with twinkling lights strung across the trees and music drifting from a nearby band. As they strolled, hand in hand, Eleanor couldn't help but smile. There was something about this time of year, something about the way the town came alive with the spirit of the season, that made her feel like anything was possible. "I've been thinking," Finn said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what we talked about on our trip, about what comes next." Eleanor turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't realized just how much she had been thinking about the future, too. The thought of them building a life together, of sharing more than just the quiet moments, filled her with a mixture of excitement and wonder. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, her fingers tightening around his. Finn looked at her, his expression thoughtful but warm. "Well, I know we've been taking things slow, and I think that's been good for us. But I also think we're ready for something more. We've both grown, and I feel like we're at a place where we can start thinking about the future together. Not just the next few months, but the long term. You know?" Eleanor's heart fluttered in her chest. She had always imagined a future with Finn, but the reality of it now seemed so much more tangible, so much closer than it had ever felt before. She had never been one to rush into things, but in this moment, she felt ready to take that next step, whatever it might look like. "I think I'm ready for that too," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you. Whatever that means." Finn smiled, a look of relief and joy crossing his face. "You know, I've been thinking about something else too." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What's that?" He grinned. "Well, I've been looking at houses around here. I know it sounds crazy, but I want to know if you'd ever consider making this town our home. Maybe not right now, but in the future. A house. A place where we can build our lives together." The question hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor realized that the thought of building a future with Finn didn't scare her. It was something she wanted, something she could see herself doing. She had always felt at home in Pinebrook, but now, the idea of having a home with Finn, of creating a space just for them, felt like a dream she was ready to make real. "I'd love that," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "I'd love to make Pinebrook our home. Together." Finn squeezed her hand, his smile bright. "I'm glad you feel that way." The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of excitement, their conversation turning to all the possibilities that lay ahead. They spoke about the kind of house they would want, one with a big kitchen where they could cook together, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and maybe even a small garden. They talked about the kind of life they wanted to create, a life filled with laughter, love, and shared moments, no matter how small. As they made their way back through the market, the soft glow of the Christmas lights casting a warm, magical light over the streets, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't about the big, dramatic moments. It was about the quiet, everyday acts of love and commitment that made up the fabric of their lives. Finn turned to her, his expression soft but sincere. "I know we still have a lot to figure out, but I'm excited for what comes next." "Are you?" Eleanor looked up at him, her heart full, "More than I've ever been." And as they walked through the snow-covered streets, hand in hand, the world around them felt full of possibilities. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't matter. They were facing it together. Chapter 17. Love, Unbroken. The weeks that followed their conversation in the market felt like a blur. Christmas came and went with the usual charm of Pinebrook, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Eleanor and Finn had started talking seriously about their future, and that conversation, the one that had felt so daunting just a few months ago, was now something they embraced. The idea of building a life together wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming a reality. It wasn't that they had everything figured out. Far from it. They still had their fears, their uncertainties, and the lingering questions about what their future would look like. But there was a quiet confidence between them, an unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. They continued to spend time with each other, working through the little things. But there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The new year loomed just around the corner, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. One cold evening, as the days began to grow longer, Eleanor sat on the porch of the cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The town had settled into its winter rhythm, and the bustle of the holiday season had faded into a peaceful calm. There was a chill in the air, but the evening sky, painted with shades of deep purple and orange, was breathtaking. It felt like the perfect moment for reflection. Finn walked out onto the porch, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. He smiled when he saw her, his eyes lighting up in that way that always made her heart skip a beat. "Thinking about something?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Eleanor smiled, taking a sip from her mug. "Just everything, I guess," she said softly. "It's been such a strange year, hasn't it?" Finn nodded, his gaze softening as he looked out at the street. "Yeah, it feels like everything has changed, but at the same time, everything feels like it's falling into place. Like we're exactly where we're supposed to be." She looked over at him, her heart swelling. "I think I'm starting to believe that too." There was a long pause between them, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with understanding. Then Finn spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. "I've been thinking about what we talked about," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "About the house and the future. I know we're not rushing into anything, but I think it's time for us to start looking. I want to find a place where we can really start building something together. I want a place that feels like ours." Eleanor felt a rush of emotion wash over her. The thought of taking that step, of finding a home together, filled her with both excitement and a little bit of nervousness. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that this was the right move. "I think I'd like that too," she said, her voice steady with determination. "I want to start looking with you. I want us to create a space that feels like home." Finn grinned, his eyes lighting up with that familiar warmth. "You mean it?" "More than anything," she said, her voice soft but sure. Finn leaned in, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "Then let's do it. Let's find our home." The weight of his words settled between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There was something deeply reassuring in knowing they were moving forward, together. They had already faced so much. Misunderstandings, heartache, the slow rebuilding of trust. And yet, here they were, stronger than ever. Over the next few weeks, they began their search in earnest. It wasn't an easy process, but it was one they faced with a sense of excitement. They visited houses in Pinebrook, exploring each one with curiosity and an eye toward what could be. Some felt too big, others too small, but as they visited more places, they started to get a clearer picture of what they wanted. Each weekend, they would meet for breakfast, poring over listings and discussing the merits of each house. Finn would joke about how many windows a house needed to be perfect, while Eleanor would insist that the kitchen was the most important room. They argued over whether a big backyard or a cozy study was the better choice. But through all the banter, there was an undeniable sense of partnership between them. One afternoon, as they walked through a charming house on the edge of town, Eleanor felt a spark of something. The moment they stepped inside, she could already picture their future here. Cozy mornings in the kitchen, evenings curled up by the fire, weekends spent in the garden. There was something about this house that felt like it was meant for them. Finn could see it too. They spent the next hour walking through the rooms, discussing their vision for each space. The house had a character to it, with its old wooden beams and large windows that let in the sunlight. It was the kind of place they could imagine making their own. a place to grow, to make memories, to share their lives. When they stood in the living room, looking out at the quiet street, Eleanor turned to Finn, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "This feels right, doesn't it?" she asked softly. Finn smiled at her, a look of pure joy crossing his face. "It does." And just like that, in that moment, Eleanor knew. This was it. This was the next chapter in their story. They didn't need to see any other houses. They had found their place. The process of buying the house was a whirlwind. There were papers to sign, inspections to be done, and decisions to be made about furniture and paint colors. But through it all, Eleanor and Finn worked together, making choices that reflected both of their tastes, blending their worlds into something that felt uniquely theirs. By the time they moved in, the house was more than just walls and rooms. It was a home, filled with the warmth of their shared dreams. As they unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, there was an undeniable sense of accomplishment between them. They had worked hard to get here, and now they were starting a new chapter. A chapter that would be full of its own challenges and rewards. On their first night in the house, as they sat on the couch, surrounded by boxes and the quiet hum of their new life, Finn took Eleanor's hand in his. "Can you believe we're here?" he asked, his voice soft. Eleanor smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I can't, but I'm so glad we are." And as they sat there, in the warmth of their new home, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they would face it together.